Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jamie Loeb, and I'm the Senior Director of Cultural Arts here at the JCC of Metro Detroit. It is my pleasure to welcome you to what I know will be a fascinating discussion this afternoon, presented by the Detroit Jewish Book Fair, SAJE, and the Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University. Detroit Jewish Book Fair is celebrating our 70th anniversary this year by presenting 70 stories for a whole year of exciting programming such as today's event. We began with a summer book bash in August, and today we present to you story number 12. Gold star to anyone who could keep track all the way to 70. Our festival week is coming up soon, starting November 6th and lasting all the way through November 14th. We hope you'll join us for a really, really special week of events and ideas, and of course, lots of books. You can see the full lineup for this virtual event here on our website. There it is, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. And of course, it is never too early to start reading. You can find all of the books that we'll be presenting here at our bookstore online. We are so glad that you can join us today. We are broadcasting live on October 28th, Thursday afternoon. And while you're here, we hope that you will be part of the fun. You can ask questions or comment in the YouTube comment section below, or you can text questions to the number on your screen right there, 248-973-7286. That number will stay on your screen. So let us know what you think and what your questions are. We have a really wonderful presentation planned, but our speakers will take as many questions as they can. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Professor Howard Lupovitch. He is the director of the Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University and an expert in the history of Jews in Western and Middle Europe. He is a great friend of the JCC, of course, and we are thrilled to be working with him to produce this event. Please join me in welcoming Professor Howard Lupovitch.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. Myself at the Cohn-Haddow Center, we're very pleased to be participating in it. We're always happy to work with the JCC in whatever venue or for whatever event. I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce our speaker today, and we're really in for a treat because she is really one of the leading scholarly voices in the study of Soviet Jewry and Russian Jewry. Let me say a few words to introduce her. Professor Elissa Bemporad earned her PhD at Stanford University. She's currently the Unger Chair in Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Queens College, and also teaches at the CUNY Graduate School. She has written several books, several award-winning books. She's won the National Jewish Book Award twice. The book she's not speaking about today is about the Jews of Minsk, which is an excellent book. She's part of a wave of scholarship, really, on Russian and Soviet Jewry post 1990. You know, many of the books written about Russian and Soviet Jews since 1990, when the archives of the former Soviet Union opened up, would have been virtually impossible to write beforehand. And before 1990, we always imagined that what we'd be able to do if the archives ever opened up, and then they did open up, and the historians who went there surpassed even our wildest expectations. There's been a flood of excellent and original scholarship, and Professor Bemporad is very much part of that. The book she's going to speak about today, Legacy of Blood, about Soviet anti-Semitism, is just her latest scholarly achievement. Not only a worthwhile read, but a very important subject. I would say that one of the reasons why it's so important is for many of us non-specialists, when we think about anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, we tend to jump forward to Elie Wiesel and the Jews of Silence and the Refuseniks in the 60s and the 70s. But actually, this is a story that goes back much further. And Professor Bemporad is going to take us through some of its early years and its early developments and give us a much better and more nuanced understanding of this very important subject. So please join me in welcoming Professor Elissa Bemporad today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to Professor Lupovitch for the generous introduction, to Wayne State for inviting me, to Jamie Loeb at the Detroit JCC and the Jewish Book Fair for, also for hosting me. And thank you all for being here. So let me start actually by showing the PowerPoint that I have, asking Jamie to help out. You can see here the cover of my book. And what I will be sharing with you is largely based on this new book. I'm showing you here the cover, Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviets, which studies what happened to the two most extreme manifestations of anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia, namely pogroms and the blood libel, under the Soviets. So what happened to them under the Soviets after 1917 in a system that, at least on paper, rejected anti-Semitism? My goal today is actually to explore this by focusing only on the blood libel, which is, as most of you know, the false accusation that goes back to the Middle Ages, according to which Jews kill Christian children to use their blood for ritual purposes, primarily as a crucial ingredient for matzah at the time of Passover. I'm showing you here a slide, please. Some representations of the alleged crime. These are representations from the Middle Ages. And in a way, the accusation of ritual murder is closely connected to the accusation that Jews killed Christ. It was, in a way, a sort of reenactment of the killing of Christ. Now, I want to consider the persistence and the permutation of the blood libel in the context of modern Eastern Europe, mostly Ukraine and Belarusia, which came under the Soviet Union. So in the interwar period, but also during World War II, and then in the post-Holocaust period. Then I will, in the last section of this talk, I will touch upon the question of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the Soviet Union and how it might connect to the question of blood libel or ritual murder. So to begin, and I'm going to ask Jamie to show the next slide, I want to introduce visually the topic and then make an observation. So to visually introduce the topic, let me show you the painting that I'm showing you now about ritual murder that captures one of the modern permutations, one of the changes of the accusation script, whereby it is not a child who is being murdered, but a young woman. So this painting was commissioned by a Russian aristocrat in 1898. It was publicly shown in St. Petersburg in 1914 and has recently been discovered in the city of London. Now, the fear and anxiety of the Slavic people materialized through the ritual murder of a young woman. This is a massive painting. It is 5 meters by 8. And what you see here, and Jamie, if you could move to the next slide, is a group of dreadful Jewish vampires. These are rabbis who carry out the ritual by drawing the young woman's blood with a number of sharp instruments, including their teeth. And the blood libel narrative is further modernized by the addition of an obviously sexual subtext. As you can see, the naked prey is not only murdered through torture and the drawing out of the blood, she also appears as the potential victim of rape, as ritual murder becomes sexual murder. So I'm just introducing here how the narrative, the traditional, the classic understanding of blood libel changes over time. Now, the observation, which is necessary in order to appreciate the question of change underwent by this accusation, and in general understand how Soviet authorities related to anti-Semitism. So with few exceptions, under the Soviet regime, primarily Ukraine and Belarusia, where the majority of Jews lived, the blood libel did not dovetail with the pogrom as in Tsarist Russia. And at least during the 1920s and 1930s, public attacks and displays of violence against Jews were not tolerated by the Soviet state, but were condemned and were prosecuted. This attitude on the part of Soviet authorities grows out of the Soviet campaign against anti-Semitism that was launched in 1918, not because Lenin liked the Jews, but it was a way to reject the Tsar's legacy, and specifically the Tsar's legacy of anti-Semitism. And this campaign against anti-Semitism was celebrated on paper, at least until World War II, as we will see later in the talk. Claims of Jewish ritual murder in the Soviet Union would be followed by criminal investigations and the arrest of those who made the false accusations. And I'm going to ask you, Jamie, to show the next slide. So there were criminal investigations and the arrest of those who made the false accusations. This did not happen anywhere else in Eastern Europe at the time, where usually the accused Jews were put on trial and sometimes arrested. Unlike Tsarist Russia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, the blood libel ceased to be politically and culturally accepted. Accusations, as you see from these quotes, against Jews did take place, but so the blood libel does crop up socially, but there are no trials against Jews accused of committing ritual murder. They were never held under the Soviets. The Bolsheviks exhibited an impressive resolve in stomping out the blood libel and prosecuted those who resorted to the accusation. As you can see, the two quotes refer, one to a case in Poltava, Ukraine, and the other one in Minsk in Belarus. And in this case, the people who were put on trial, who made the accusation and were put on trial, lost their jobs and were arrested. From the very beginning, the regime dramatically and publicly rejected the Bailey's case. And I'm going to ask you, Jamie, to show here. This is the image of Andrei Yushchinsky, who was a young boy who's the alleged victim of this well-known ritual murder trial. This is a poster that appeared throughout the city of Kiev, warning parents about the upcoming Passover. And so beware of where your children are, because it's the Jewish Passover and Jews will kidnap your children. The Bailey's Affair, 1911-1913, was the most spectacular blood libel in modern Europe. The trial was the result of the invention of high echelons of the Russian government with the support of the Ministry of Justice and the approval of Nicholas II, and it was fueled by the reactionary and monarchist elements in Russian society. The next slide, please, Jamie. The arrest and trial of Menachem Mendel Beilis, who you see here in Kiev, in Tsarist Kiev, who was accused of killing the young boy, and eventually acquitted on the dubious verdict that left room for much disbelief. And I'm showing you also in the next slide, please, Jamie. Here there are quotes by a conservative Russian thinker, a church thinker, and by Lenin. So that you see the different opinions about the Bailey's affair. But what is interesting is that in an event of great symbolic significance, the Soviet authorities tried and executed the major figures involved in the Bailey's trial as soon as they are in power. So after the revolution of 1917, that is a priority for the new system. Let me now turn to World War II, which drastically swayed the habits and rhetoric of violence in the German-occupied territories of the Soviet Union during the total ethnic war unleashed in June 1941, in which approximately 1.5 million Jews were killed, most of them in mass shooting operations carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, the German death squads, and their collaborators. What we see is a revived anti-Bolshevik sentiment that quickly came to intersect with wartime anti-Jewish propaganda. And anti-Jewish propaganda from World War II often featured, World War I and World War II often featured a ritual murder subtext, building on the century-old myth that Jews killed Christian children because they need the blood for ritual purposes. In turn, the blood libel trope drew new inspiration from the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, namely this idea that Soviet communism was really part of a wider Jewish plot to seize power. So I'm going to ask you, Jamie, to show the next slide. Thank you. So here you see a drawing that was made in November 1941 by a Ukrainian young man. He was a worker. And this painting depicts Stalin holding a knife in his hand, surrounded by hundreds of skulls. This young worker seemingly built his amateur art on the well-known anti-Bolshevik depictions from the Civil War, 1917, 1921. Please, Jamie, the next slide. These are depictions of Leon Trotsky, the founder of the Red Army, and you see in the background the skulls. If you can also show the next slide. He's again surrounded by skulls and bones, and also the next slide. Finally, where you see this is actually from also from the same period. It's another depiction of Leon Trotsky, again surrounded by skulls, by bones, but also you can see the hands dripping in blood. So the idea is this is a murderous entity that is slaughtering and committing a crime against civilians. And the next slide, which is actually from World War II, and here again you see the Jews, the Jewish Satan is hiding under Stalin's mask. So and then finally the next slide, which has the quote from this amateur art that I showed you earlier, where you can see again the how the worker portrayed the Soviet leader toiling on behalf of the bloodthirsty Jew as the embodiment of the Judeo-Bolshevik myth. Now, what I'm showing you here are not necessarily iconographic representations of ritual murder, but they do capture the ways in which during World War I and World War II, Jews came to be seen as the prime actors of a modern version of ritual murder, this time carried out in the name of communism. Now, at times, Nazi propaganda explicitly encouraged the exploitation of the blood libel theme in conjunction with the Judeo-Bolshevik myth. Ritual murder and communism both embodied the Jewish spirit and lust for power. In one case that I discovered, for example, in the spring of 1942, the Germans executed all the Jews in a small town in the Kiev province, accusing them of murdering for ritual purposes a Red Army soldier. When the body of the POW was discovered, the Germans spread the blood libel rumor. They staged a trial and sentenced the Jews to death. Prior to the execution, the victims were tortured. And although there was no immediate reason for the Germans to exploit ritual murder to justify their extermination policy, they still chose to do so. Now, next slide. This is the book cover. This is a book on the blood libel entitled Jüdische Ritualmord, or The Jewish Ritual Murder, from 1943. It was published and distributed throughout German-occupied Soviet territories. the Nazi Party member Helmut Schramm, who wrote this book, wrote it really to promote anti-Bolshevik propaganda and stimulate anti-Semitism among those handling the Jewish question in Soviet-occupied territories. This edition is from 1944, the edition that I'm showing you. Now, Jamie, the next slide, please. So this is another example of what is happening at the time. The Ukrainian language newspaper, published under German occupation, also provides an example of how the blood libel theme was exploited during the war. This is from August 1943. It was issued in Kiev. And this newspaper featured a detailed analysis of the murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. And the image that I'm showing you here is the room where they were, in the basement where they were killed in July. So published on the 25th anniversary of the massacre at Yekaterinburg and entitled The Jews' Right Hand, the account presented the assassination of the Tsar's family as a ritual murder carried out by Jewish Bolsheviks. And I hope you have read this quote that gives you a sense of how it is rendered, right? There's a reference to the Jewish Kahal, the Jewish community that ordered the murder of the Tsar's family. And it is in a way a new kind of ritual murder. The order to execute the Romanov family came directly from Lenin, but the telegram from Moscow with the directive was indeed signed by Sverdlov, who was Jewish and who in 1918 was chairman of the Central Executive Committee of the Congress of Soviets of the Russian SFSR. But in its account of the murder, the Ukrainian newspaper provides the names and ethnicity of the major killers of the Tsar's family, identifying 7 out of 9 as Jewish. In fact, only 2 of the executioners were of Jewish origin. What is interesting is that ritual murder accusations turned up even in those regions, such as Central Asia, that did not come under direct German military occupation and were thus removed from the vigorous wartime propaganda. Jamie, please, the next slide. Here you see Soviet Kyrgyzia in Central Asia, which saw momentous growth in its Jewish population from the small pre-war Bukharan and Ashkenazi communities, with thousands of refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied territories who settled there and experienced the blood accusation, but in a new wartime context. So in the summer of 1942, a group of 20 Jewish women, wives of Red Army soldiers, and you see here the quote, of Red Army soldiers who were fighting at the front, address a letter to Stalin himself. And they complain, this is from the letter, they complain about anti-Semitism in 2 cities nearby and observe, and quote, what you read in this quote, that Jews are killing children of other nations, even using their body parts to make soup. Now, just to contextualize, wartime food shortages, rumors about cannibalism on the Eastern Front, hearsay of the blood libel accusation, as well as the actual murder of 2 children in one of the cities in the area, served as the background and pretext for the accusation. These were well removed from the more traditional Passover plot, which involved the abduction of Christian children and the use of their blood for religious purposes. In particular, as we know, the consumption of matzah. Here, there is no mention of matzah. But what we know is that there was a Soviet secret police report that followed the Jewish women's grievance. And this report confirmed that there were widespread anti-Semitic comments that resulted in harassment, physical abuse, targeting Jews, that focused on Jews killing the children of other nationalities to use their body parts to make food, to make soup. So we have here kind of a secularized version of the blood libel, whereby you no longer have blood being used for matzah. So the murder is not carried out. It's not ritual in nature, but it seems to be predatory and merciless cannibalism, as bloodthirsty. The bloodthirstiness becomes almost a Jewish ethnic and racial trait rather than a religious one. I would now like to dwell on a case study that allows us to really zoom in on the impact of war on the permutation of the blood libel narrative. We are in the summer of 1945, so after the war. And Jamie, I'm going to ask you to show the next slide. This is the beautiful city of Lvov, or Lviv today in Ukraine. It used to be Western Poland. You can show also the next slide with the map, so you can see where Lviv is. It was liberated from the Germans and then came under the Soviets. And it became an arena of a ritual murder accusation against the Jews. According to the allegations, local Jews had kidnapped Polish and Ukrainian children, murdered them, and hid their corpses within the confines of one of the local synagogues. And I'm going to ask you to show the next slide. This is the synagogue. Instigated by the rumors, a crowd of 400 people gathered in the Lviv Krakowski marketplace by the neighboring synagogue that you see here in this image. And there's a lot of commotion. There's a number of physical attacks against Jewish passerbys, assertions, and almost, a pogrom talk. Some of the statements are very interesting. There is disappointment that Hitler had not come to the city 20 years earlier, which would have prevented the Jews from killing children. Some people voiced their rage over the traces of blood of the alleged murdered children in the synagogue courtyard. Others cried that Jews had stole children, slaughtered them, and turned their bodies into food to sell at the marketplace. And without the intervention of the city police and of Soviet authorities, these accusations most likely would have spiraled into a pogrom, as anti-Jewish violence triggered by blood libel rumors had become a common feature in other areas of Eastern Europe at the time. Some of you might know of the well-known pogrom in July of 1946 that erupted in the city of Kielce in Poland following a ritual murder accusation when 42 Jews were killed. And these are all Holocaust survivors. But here we are under, Lviv is under the Soviets. So anyway, you have many refugees, Holocaust survivors who took shelter in the synagogue building. And Jamie, you can show the next image of the synagogue today. This is one of the few synagogues still standing in post-war Lviv. And what is interesting is that you have an investigation, and I found the documents in the archives from 1945 to 1946. The police department, the public prosecutor's office, the prosecutor's office of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Soviet secret police investigate this accusation, according to which Jews killed Polish and Ukrainian children in the synagogue and then hid their bodies in the building's basement. And you can show the next slide, please, Jamie. In the report of the preliminary investigation, the senior investigator of the prosecutor's office stated, and it's almost as if he's doing it to reassure the public that of the diligence and how thorough the investigation was, he assured him of the following, and you can read his words in the quote on the slide. So the police found instead large quantities of chicken feathers and traces of chicken blood of the poultry slaughtered according to the Jewish ritual in the synagogue courtyard. And think about the image that I showed you earlier. The fact that in 1945 the Jews in the city of Lviv performed ritual slaughter in the synagogue courtyard might have been, at least for some, evocative of an alleged Jewish adaptness with blood rituals and reminiscent of other alleged Jewish ritual, namely the blood libel. Anyway, the police report recorded the details of the incident. And Jamie, please show the next slide. Here you have comments made by bystanders, or actually people who called for the destruction of the synagogue and for a pogrom. A Polish woman who declared that bodies of Polish children with slit throats were found in the synagogue, and other comments that you see on the slide. According to one complainant, argued that there were as many as 600 bodies of Ukrainian and Polish children in the synagogue. Remember, this is 1945, early 1946. So eventually, Soviet authorities arrested 5 people of Ukrainian and Polish nationality, accusing them of inciting national hatred against the Jewish people, which would not be tolerated in the Soviet Union, so it seemed. One of them in particular worried Soviet authorities at the time. This was a 25-year-old man by the name of Ivan Fedak, who had worked for the Germans from 1941 until the Soviets reoccupied the city. He had served in the police force, and also, and Jamie, please show the next slide, he also served in the SS division Halichina, which was made up of Ukrainians and was a German military organization made of Ukrainian volunteers who helped carry out mass shooting operations of Ukrainian Jews. So the prosecutor's office found out that Fedak, this young man, had taken part in the massacres of Jews. So the trial confirmed his guilt and the guilt of the other defendants who were charged with inciting national hatred against the Jews, and they were sentenced to prison. However, and this is what I'm interested in, and I found out by working in the archives, Soviet authorities changed their mind a few months later about the culprits in this accusation against the Jewish refugees in Lviv about ritual murder. And this is symptomatic of how the Soviets in the post-war period moved away from their commitment to fight against anti-Semitism. It was no longer their concern. Actually, the Soviet state could come to encourage anti-Semitism. By April 1946, less than 1 year after their arrest, the new prosecutor's office released them and said there's no evidence. And even though Fedak had collaborated with the Germans in killing Jews and had made the accusation that Jews engaged in ritual murder, he was released from prison. He was not guilty of instigating national hatred. What is interesting is that the way in which Soviet authorities quickly revised their approach to the crime is a strong sign of the times. By late 1946, the Soviets showed little interest in the subject of Nazi collaboration, anti-Semitism, or for that matter, in stomping out ritual murder and prosecuting those who engaged in the accusation. The general absence of and I'm going to ask you, Jamie, to show the next slide. Yes, we can leave the next slide and you guys can start reading. So the general absence of a public condemnation of blood libels during and after the war, particularly from the early 1940s until 1953, the date of Stalin's death, is not that surprising given the growing state anti-Semitism that is, promoted by Stalin. With the post-World War II reversal of the Emancipation Project that was embraced by the Bolsheviks, the notion of Soviet universalism and of this idea of brotherhood of peoples rejected the Jews. The Jewish question, or whether Jews should be accepted, and if so, on what terms, was not asked openly and publicly. But anti-Semitism became more virulent. It became a widely employed and somewhat accepted cultural code. If in the interwar period, so before World War II, anti-Semitism had gone into hiding at the official level, the Cold War unearthed it once again and made it a respectable attitude, a respectable position and emotion. The new geopolitical order, in particular, as we all know, the 1948 establishment of the State of Israel, made Jews the most unreliable and foreign ethnic group in the Soviet Union, and Zionist, which became a code word for imperialist, cosmopolitan, and Jew. Their patriotism could not be trusted. And the doctor's plot of 1953, and these are the quotes that you see on the slide. So the doctor's plot of 1953, which was the alleged conspiracy of Soviet doctors, almost all of whom happened to be Jewish, to murder government and party officials, is unleashed. And it has been, by the way, referred to as the Bailey's case of the atomic age. So there is an awareness here of an underlying ritual murder narrative. It was interpreted as a new version of the blood libel, and you see the quotes here. Look especially at the second quote, and I highlighted where Jews are not referred to as Jews, but they're referred to as Israelites. There's a clear reference here to Israel, to the state of Israel. Images like this following image, Jamie, if you could show it, please. Like this one of a Jewish doctor who is unmasked as an enemy of the people, who's really serving Zionism and imperialism, the interests of the US and of the state of Israel. This image became widely published in the Soviet press. It was broadcast, not the image, but this news was broadcast on the radio. It was discussed in the Soviet schools' classrooms. So in the post-war period, the secular blood libel accusation, which is deprived of its religious contours, whereby Jews become a murderous threat, came to intersect with the Soviet propaganda against Zionism, especially after 1967. And Jamie, if you could show the next slides. Even here you see the hands of the Jewish soldiers that are dripping in blood. And the next slide, this is from 1967. This is Moshe Dayan, who is, taking over the Arab countries. His hands are also dripping in blood, and he's holding a knife. The next slide also, Jamie, which is very interesting. And you can, this is from a May Day parade. And as you watch the slide, I just want to mention that in 1974, almost 20 years after Stalin's death, the image of the Jew as a murderer of children was still alive and could be exploited by the authorities in their battle against Jewish emigration to Israel. Of course, they're opposed to Jewish emigration to Israel, right? So I found information about this practicing pediatrician. His name is Michael Stern, who had worked for over 36 years in the city of Vinnytsia in Ukraine, and he applied to move to Israel with his family in 1974, and he was promptly arrested by the local KGB officials. And what is interesting is that the official charges filed against him had nothing to do actually with his intentions to resettle in Israel, but were reframed by referring to a doctor's plot medical blood libel. He was accused of attempting to poison little children who were under his care as a doctor. Jamie, if you can show the next slide as well. This is another image again of Soviet propaganda, and the next image also. No, you can go back. Stay with the, yes, that's the last. So these images are also a reminder of how Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda informs, in a way, contemporary radical left anti-Semitism. So we can trace the association between Zionism and Israel as demonized as a quintessentially evil and imperialist endeavor to the Soviet Union. In conclusion, I've described how the blood libel accusation evolves in modern times, and I've shown you how we can find echoes of ritual murder accusations whenever Jews are imagined as serving or leading a foreign, international, threatening ideology, agency, or entity. With regards to Zionism, I just want to close with the versions of the ritual murder myth that still persist today in the former Soviet Union, intersecting with notions of a dangerous enemy preying on society and showing an affinity with the classic blood libel narrative. So in Ukraine, for example, claims of a Zionist ritual murder echoed in the 2009 statements made by a Ukrainian writer, Vyacheslav Gudin, who publicly claimed that 15 Ukrainian children who had been adopted in Israel had in fact been taken to Israeli medical centers and used for spare parts. And also later he argued that as many as 25,000 Ukrainian children had been taken to Israel over the course of 2 years to harvest their organs. And then the last slide, Jamie. And then I want to go back to, as I finish, to the perfect symbiosis between the Judeo-Bolshevik myth and the more traditional or modern ritual murder, has since reemerged in the Russian context. In Russia, the investigative committee of the Russian Federation reopened in 2018 the case of the murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. And I showed you quotes and an image where they were killed earlier. On the initiative of Bishop Tikhon Shevkunov, who happens also to be close to Russia's President Vladimir Putin, the committee pledged to corroborate once and for all whether the execution of the family of Nicholas II's family, of the Romanov family, in the summer of 1918, on the orders of the Bolsheviks, had in fact been an act of Jewish ritual murder. And in this slide, I'm just showing you, the highlight here is Trotsky, who's standing next to Lenin, who's dressed in red, and he is, of course, holding the knife over the body that symbolizes Russia. So the implication of this investigation, of course, was not only that Jews routinely commit such crimes, it also aligned very closely Jews with the Bolshevik system, reinforcing the long-standing myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, which is still used today to explain and at times justify the actions of the perpetrators of the genocide of European Jewry. And on that note, I'm finished with my talk.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent and insightful talk. I think now we have some questions. So Let me look at the questions from the comments, and then I also have a few questions of my own. I mean, it's so fascinating. So the first question: if the Bolsheviks were against anti-Semitism, why was so much anti-Jewish propaganda sanctioned? How do you square those two things?
So we have to distinguish between popular anti-Semitism and state-sponsored anti-Semitism. From the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, from 1918 until the early 1940s, there is no anti-Jewish propaganda. From above, there is nothing. Quite to the contrary, as I have tried to show and argue, the state, regional authorities and central authorities, when when the Jews convince them that this is important, will condemn anti-Semitism. In the press, you have it. You have a significant literature, actually, against anti-Semitism, rather widespread. So there is no official anti-Semitism until World War II. During World War II, things change. In the beginning, anti-Semitism is really, marginalized. It's not important. We are now focusing on the war effort, and Jews are not important. It's not in the state's interest. With the establishment of the State of Israel, and by the way, already after the war, you start seeing more of an interplay between popular anti-Semitism and official anti-Semitism, right? And this explodes in a way with the establishment of the State of Israel and the Cold War, when Jews are identified as public enemy number one. They cannot be trusted because they have, they don't have a republic within the Soviet Union like every other nationality. But oh my goodness, now they have a republic in a way. They have their own state outside of the Soviet Union. So in the context of the Cold War, they really become the enemy par excellence. Of course, there are layers of continuity that built on assumptions of Jewish disloyalty that go back to, even the Tsar's period. So that's when you have, but again, what I showed you here, the Soviets will argue, although we can see that this is anti-Semitic, right? The posters that I showed you that condemn Zionism, but the Soviets would say that this is not anti-Semitism, that this is anti-Zionist. So they separate the two very clearly. I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, I'll follow up that question with this. I mean, with this, there seems to be this correlation, or there's a role of the existence of the State of Israel and State of Israel being identified as a Western state. But there was a moment in 1948 when the Soviet Union expected Israel to be an ally. Before, they recognized Israel first, and it was only after. So at that moment, or during that window when Israel was perceived to be an ally of the Soviet Union, was there a diminishing of anti-Semitism? I mean, did it reverberate into the popular sphere? Was there a sense that no, Zionism or the Jewish state is not an adversary, but rather a friend? Did it cut in the other direction?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there seemed to be a moment. Gromyko is, he's the first one. I mean, the Soviet Union is the first. State to acknowledge, to write in support, to vote in support of the establishment of the State of Israel, hoping, geopolitically that they can establish, a communist entity in the Middle East. I mean, they did have a lot of support on the left in before the establishment, I guess, in Palestine, and after the establishment in Israel. So there is that possibility. Of course, what is interesting is that if we read the speech that is given, the official speech of endorsement of the Soviet Union, the Soviet authorities acknowledge the suffering of Jews during the Holocaust, because this is a foreign policy domain, whereas within the Soviet Union, Jews are not allowed to commemorate publicly the Holocaust. So that duality is there. In other words, what I'm saying is that the main reason for anti-Semitism in the post-war period is Israel. It's the reason number one. But the fact that Jews were claiming a particular space of suffering in the context of the Great Patriotic War was also a problem for Soviet authorities, something that they could not accept. So that would have led to some kind of anti-Semitism. And then if I can add on to that, there is a lot of popular anti-Semitism that has been dormant during when the state controlled it. But because of the German occupation and the German propaganda, local authorities, regional authorities have also been influenced by this propaganda, and also start, disliking more and more Jews. So there also is that that aspect that we need to keep into consideration.
So here's another question. I think this is a broader question. The implications of what you've been talking about here. It's fascinating. Because I guess it's sort of a comparative question, because these days, when we hear a lot, we hear the anti-Semitism of the left and the anti-Semitism of the right, and I think there's a tendency these days to sort of try to deflect criticisms of the anti-Semitism of the right, I mean the contemporary anti-Semitism, by pointing to the fact that Stalin was anti-Semitic too. Okay, that's a popular mantra right now, and with this in mind, I guess it always occurred to me that yes, without diminishing any anti-Semitism, without diminishing the evils of Stalin and Stalinism and how it affected Jews, the fact of the matter is that Jews under Stalin, Jews in the Soviet Union, I mean, several million were able to live for 50 or 60 years, even if they had certain restrictions and even if they faced certain adversity. And the same can certainly not be said about the prospect of Jews living under Hitler, which they could barely last 5 years. So just in terms of survival rate or survivability, I mean, is it reasonable to say that however harsh Stalin's anti-Semitism was, it still wasn't the same kind of threat, existential threat that Hitler's anti-Semitism posed? I mean, if you want, you can say apples and oranges. That's fine too. But I'm just curious. These days, we sort of, it's tough not to juxtapose one authoritarian anti-Semitism against another authoritarian anti-Semitism.
No, that's a very interesting question. A question that I'm very interested in, and something that one of my favorite writers, Vasily Grossman, engaged with. He's one of the, considered the Soviet Tolstoy. He was Jewish, and he's one of the contributors to the Black Book. And he's the first one who compared the Nazi system to the Soviet system. And he said, really, what they have in common is anti-Semitism. So he compared them through his experience as a Jew. I do agree with you that, that based on what we know, certainly it was much better to be a Jew in the Soviet Union, especially if you were forced to evacuate to Central Asia, because so many, thousands and thousands of Jews who were, forced to resettle in Central Asia or flee the German army that is advancing, escape murder. This is unintentional, of course. That was not the goal of Stalin. So in general, I agree with you. We don't know what would have happened had he not died in March of 1953. What I'm interested in is, as a historian, I am interested in the fact that, this identifying Israel as demonizing Israel, let's say demonizing Israel, has its roots in Soviet and the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign. It's complicated. At times it wasn't specifically anti-Jewish, but it came across as anti-Jewish. I mean, some of the images that I showed you, and there are ups and downs, it goes in waves. But I'm interested in this aspect that, the left has, the radical left, of course, has, this is not to say that well, let me just leave it at that. Actually, let me not make political statements. But
right. I don't mind doing that. I can do that for both of us, or at least for me. So would you say, to follow up, how would you compare the demonizing of Israel by Stalin then versus the demonizing of Israel now? Because it seems now that demonizing focuses around the treatment of the Palestinians, and it doesn't seem to have been the issue for Stalin at all. In other words, they're both demonizing Israel, but are they doing it for unrelated reasons? Are these two similar but not connected demonizings? Because oftentimes you hear now people who want to object to the demonizing of Israel now say, well, this is a very left-wing thing and it's been going on since Stalin, but it seems like Stalin is doing it for a very different reason.
Well, he was, he connected, he saw Israel, and I think we saw it in some of the cartoons that I showed, as an agent of American imperialism. So it really was, I mean, it has to be understood in the context of the Cold War, and also understood in light of his paranoia of this capitalist encirclement that had always been there, since from his vantage point, since the Civil War, or since the early years of the Soviet Union. Then you actually have it in a way through the Cold War. So I think that the geopolitics of the Cold War help us understand the differences here, at least to some extent. Yeah.
Interesting. Here we have a comment, or I guess let's call it a question that that Soviet anti-Semitism resurged during the Second World War as a result of Russian chauvinism more than as a result of the establishment of the State of Israel. How would you respond to that?
So there definitely is a renaissance, I guess, or return to Russian chauvinism, which should help, is the glue for this brotherhood of the peoples, right? So it's the Russianness that holds us all together. That definitely plays a role in the resurgence. I agree that plays a role in the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the context of the war. But then, after the war, it really is about the Holocaust, and then about Israel. The fact that Stalin does not allow the publication of the Black Book and the Red Book. The Black Book is about how Jews were singled out for destruction by the Germans as they occupied the Soviet Union. That's, the extraordinary accounts that were collected by Soviet Jewish writers like Ilya Ehrenburg and Vasily Grossman. And the Red Book was supposed to be published at the same time after the war, and was evidence of how Jewish Red Army soldiers fought at the front. So it was the evidence of Jewish heroism, and both are not published. So that's not necessarily related to Russian chauvinism, although Russian chauvinism does, as like all chauvinisms, plays a role in, I guess, in reviving popular anti-Semitism, for sure.
Well, to broaden a little bit, what was there an element of racial thinking in this? In other words, from the vantage point of someone like an internationalist like Stalin, who really, I mean, for him, the notion of race is not something he really embraced. But in the case of Jews, were Jews singled out partly because they were seen as being inherently not Russian and not Russifiable, if that's a word. I mean, they're sort of, I mean, it's endemically outsiders or endemically a threat. In other words, I guess the question I'm really asking is, what does this anti-Semitism say about the Russification project of first Russia and the Soviet Union vis-a-vis Jews? Do they still see it's possible for Jews to become still be Soviet citizens in light of the state of Israel and a connection to it?
Okay, so I mean, Stalin has, in a way, dealt with the Jewish question since before the revolution, right? He's the one who says that Jews should assimilate, and Lenin himself, they both said Jews should assimilate. They're not a nationality group, they should assimilate. After the revolution, they have to find this compromise. Okay, Jews are a nationality because we need to teach the Jewish masses about Marxism, so they need to have their own language, which is Yiddish, and so on. But it seemed like Jews could become Sovietized, could be embraced by, or could become members of the nation state project as applied to the Soviet Union. It's clear that the establishment of the state of Israel, in a way, brings this possibility to an end. And in Stalin, not only vis-a-vis the Jews, but vis-a-vis other ethnic groups, the Poles, Lithuanians, ethnic Germans, you always have him denying race and the fact that there might be a racial identity, and saying that Marxism is only about sociological categories. But then he does fall, at times, especially during the war and after the war, into this, racializing the sociological category. On the other hand, the fact that Lazar Kaganovich was Jewish and was never purged, and remained his closest ally in the Soviet project until he died, is telling about the fact that for him, these certain Jews could Sovietize. But the war does bring up a lot of problems, and so does the state of Israel.
So here's another interesting question. This preoccupation with Zionism and how it changes policy, it changes attitude towards Jews. There's a conspiratorial nature to it, somehow being in cahoots with the Jewish state, with the Zionist entity. Given that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion originated in Russia, is there a connection between the two? I mean, is this sort of is that attitude? Do you see in that attitude a kind of is there a synergy? Is there between the Protocols and this new conspiracy theory, or this new version of the conspiracy theory?
Absolutely, and some of the actually some of the cartoons, and I wish I had shown it, but there's one cartoon where it doesn't have to do with the ritual murder accusation, so I didn't show it. Although the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the accusation are connected, because it is about the killing of Christ. It is about Satan killing Christ, right? And so it is about this plot, right, to take over the world. There is this one cartoon where you see the Jew, the Zionist is represented through a big spider, and is taking over the Middle East, which is, one of those images that we are more familiar with when we think about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So the fact that there is this international, I think is the key word, not only for the Protocols, but also for Stalin and his fears of, loyalty, fears, his doubting that Jews could be loyal citizens. And so international is really key, and it is connected to this question of cosmopolitan, rootless. They have no root, and their only root now is outside of the borders of the Soviet Union. So it is definitely connected.
Interesting. Another question. Do you think the early Soviet defense of Jews against the blood libel that you mentioned and described, was this in part an attempt by the Soviet regime to separate itself or distinguish itself from the Tsarist regime that they overthrew?
Absolutely. I think that the campaign, and I think I mentioned it, but it was quick. The campaign against anti-Semitism, this commitment to fight anti-Semitism, does not stem so much from philo-Semitism or some, warm feelings vis-a-vis the Jews. It's really it's politics. It's about separating ourselves, meaning the Soviet, from Tsarist Russia. Kind of, separating, rejecting that legacy. And it was, they did try. This is why, I emphasize the fact that in the Bailey's case, one of, this is as early as 1921. They have just won the Civil War, and they have this woman who was at the head of this group of thieves who killed that little boy that I showed you the image of in 1911 in Kiev. They have her arrested and shot. She is shot in downtown Kiev. That is one of the first decrees signed by Lenin after the end of the Civil War, which is impressive. This is a statement. We are not like Tsarist Russia.
So what are the implications of this for the current Soviet Union? I mean, someone like Putin, when he has this relation, he has a relationship with the state of Israel, or certainly some kind of relationship. Well, is it affected by this older propaganda, or has Putin sort of rejected it, wants nothing to do with it? And does the Soviet-Israel relations now affect the status of Jews in the Soviet Union now? Is there a connection there?
That's an interesting question. I don't think that Putin likes Stalin, I guess. I mean, Putin suffers less from paranoia. He does want loyalty, and as long as he can get loyalty, he is satisfied. So he sees. He does not see the Jewish community in Russia as a threat in any way. And he, he's very pragmatic. He does not, also, the Jews in Russia are a rather small number. And so I don't see any kind of legacy there. Of course, the legacy that I emphasize is that Putin is very supportive of the Russian Orthodox Church. And there are some leaders in the Russian Orthodox Church that are not trying to revive the blood libel, but believe that that ritual murder has been, a trait, I guess, of in Jewish religion, Jewish customs, and so on. The other thing that I would say, but I don't know if this stems directly from Putin himself, is that, what we see is, for example, that Bolshevism, the Judeo-Bolshevism has not disappeared. This idea that that Bolshevism is something foreign to Russia, and that became widespread in these territories because of the Jews. And the Jew who was instrumental in this is Leon Trotsky. So for the anniversary of the revolution in 2017, there was this show on the revolution called Leon Trotsky. And you can see Trotsky, who's depicted very, very negatively as a sexual predator, and is someone who brings Bolshevism to Russia, because Russia would have rejected it, but it's the Jews who brought it to Russia. So I don't know that I've answered your question, but that's also another legacy that I see. It's not directly related to Putin, but Putin is aware of that.
Well, yeah, and it's part of the general mood. So,
Yeah.
so would you say that the Jews who live in Russia now, I mean, obviously, if they're staying, there are a variety of reasons why they stayed and not live, and everyone has their own reasons. But could part of that calculus be that the earlier anti-Semitism, there's really no ground for it now, and the situation is different enough that it's not Tsarist Russia anymore, and it's not Stalin's Soviet Union anymore, and in Putin's Russia, as long as you're loyal to Putin, you have a sense of security, and you don't really have to worry, and you don't have to look over your shoulder, well, any more than any less than anybody else. I mean, I think it would explain why Jews who are staying, especially those who feel, the group that leaps out to me is Chabad in Russia, who have a very close relationship with him. I think it's similar to Chabad in Hungary with Orban, where you make a close deal with the autocrat, and there's really no reason for you to worry about anything. You live with a certain sense of security, and in light of that, or I mean, are they the instances of anti-Semitism now? If you're someone who's loyal to Putin, is that enough to insulate you or to protect you, or is it, it's a situation that, it always reminds me of, it makes me think of Hoboken, New Jersey, a town controlled by the mob. If you have the protection of the mob, you don't have to lock your car at night, and you don't have to lock your door. Similar kind of thing. You're basically safe as long as Putin doesn't get mad at you.
I would say in general that I agree with that, and that what is interesting is that I think in terms of deviant behaviors, imagined or real, there are other groups that are problematic in Russia today. The LGBTQ community, individuals who come from Chechnya, for example, or other areas in Central Asia, who move to the cities of Russia, and who are, who can be subject to discrimination. So if you politically align yourself with Putin and you don't make too much noise, it is possible to, to be successful in Russia, or average, I guess, at the average level successful. This doesn't mean that there is no anti-Semitism, but there is no immediate reason to leave unless you don't agree politically with Putin, which would not be a small thing. But
right, and that kind of calculus would have not really been possible with Stalin. I mean, it was a more I want to say a more Hannah Arendt sort of origins of totalitarianism sort of situation where there was no bargain to be made.
Exactly.
Anyway, we want to thank you for talking to us and answering all these questions. I think we'll all agree that this was a fascinating and illuminating talk, and obviously, got to read the book. I mean, this is a path-breaking book, and we're very lucky to hear you talk about it. So thank you very much for sharing with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Elissa, and thank you, Howard. You can find Elissa's book at our bookstore at this link below. Also, of course, if you go to the Book Fair website, there is a link to it. Thank you to our guests for a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And I hope all of you can join us for upcoming Book Fair events. We have our festival week again starting November 6th, going all the way through November 14th. The full schedule is right down there, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. And we hope to see you soon. Thanks so much.